So here we've got part 2 of Celebrian. This is going to be a rather informal reading of this, because if it's anything but informal, then I won't make it. It's 2:22 in the morning. I hope to God my neighbors don't hear me reading this. They can't hear me anyway normally, but, this would be the one time they do. So, let's start part 2, shall we? Celebrian's body began to ache with the tension of holding perfectly still. What was the brute up to? Her heart filled with hope at the delay, yet she knew it could not last. "She is tired," said the king. "Bring her a stool." So many horrible images came to mind when I read that. A stool was placed behind her, and she was pushed on to it. Again with the imagery. She could not help but feel some relief at sitting, but it lasted only the few moments before the king waved at her legs, and an orc spread her legs apart so that the king had a clear view of her womanhood. No matter, she could enjoy this too. "She is thirsty. Bring her a drink." Behind her she heard an orc uncork flasks and several liquids being poured. Hob-nailed footsteps approached, and an orc hand reached out from behind her, with a leather wineskin in his hand. "Drink," said the king, gesturing with his hands. Something about his leer told her not to take the drink. She moved to bat it, but the orc stepped aside. A second orc then held her arms to her side, while the first orc pried her mouth open and poured the black flask down her throat. The oily, thick liquid burned and gagged her. It smelled of rancid sex and sweat, tasted of strong liquor with a hint of salt. They emptied the wineskin in short bursts, holding her mouth closed between draughts, so that she was forced to drink every drop. She felt the heat of the liquid burn down her throat and into her stomach. She felt the back of her throat close shut in a gag reflex, then slowly loosen. The heat in her stomach moved to her nipples and clit. To her horror, her nipples stood small and proud. She could not see her clit, but could feel the swell in her loins. Her labia protruded even farther, and she knew that her clit too was erect and proud in its soft fold of lavender flesh. All I have this image of purple flesh, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't. No. No. The king watched the liquid take its course with unmasked pleasure. His cock bobbed before him, his fist clenched at his side, his tongue danced over his meaty lips and yellowed tusks, while his nostrils flared, and his ears twitched with pleasure. "Not long now," whispered the king. He knew that the elf bitch was lost in the pulse of her body, and was no longer paying attention to him. A drop of clear liquid seeped from the tip of his cock and fell to the floor. Okay, imagery. How long Celebrian remained lost in contemplation of her awakening body she could never remember. It might have been seconds or hours. Her head had grown foggy, and her field of vision shrunk to no more than the king. She smiled at the warmth in her loins, and raised a hand to flick a nipple, not hearing the grunt of pleasure from the king. While rubbing her nipple between thumb and forefinger, she brushed her hair behind her ears with the other. The hall seemed dark to her, except for the king on his throne. Idly her gaze travelled over his yellow eyes above the pig nose and tusk, no longer noticing the bold leer. It moved down his bare, hairy chest and fixed on his great cock. His great, long, magnificent cock, so unlike the small, smooth one of her husband. Okay, now, imagine a giant chicken. That's all I can see, is a giant chicken, because that helps you get through this story. Her hand moved from her hair to her clit. She slowly rubbed both nipple and clitoris, feeling the wetness in her pussy and smelling her scent. All the while she stared at the cock in front of her. Her vision shrank further, so that all she could see was that great grey shaft and smooth head, somewhere in the hair from which it sprouted. She knew there must be a pair of balls. Would they match the size of the foot-long rod before her, she casually wondered. Yeah, they're Nerf balls. She worked her nipple and clit. Dull pleasure rolled in waves across her body. It had been a millennia since she last played this way with herself. Perhaps it had been too long because she could not bring herself to climax. A pout graced her small mouth at the frustrated desire. Unnoticed by Celebrian, the king stared at his elf bitch in high heat. His balls ached for release. More clear drops dripped on the floor. "Those little elf whores just need a push to awaken," he said. He jiggled his cock, drawing Celebrian's attention to it. She noticed the liquid dripping from its tip and involuntarily swallowed. Yet her throat balked at the attempt. The muscles were still loose from the draught. The cock called her. The giant chicken called her. What would it taste like? What would it feel like in her mouth? She had never taken Elrond into her mouth. That was not the elvish way, despite the vulgar name for... I cannot even pronounce that. Fellatio, the elvish art. She fell to her knees. The great chicken loomed before her, twisted and gnawed with its warts, bumps and pulsing veins, except for the taut, smooth knob. Like what, a doorknob? It was beautiful, rough and smooth, round and long, oh so long. She felt a pang in her loins, a desire to bury the rod in her loins. But the curiosity of her mouth won out. She rocked forward and extended her tongue to touch the tip of the glands. She caught a drop of liquid and tasted a not unpleasant saltiness. "No one touches the king without permission." The voice came as if from a distance, yet she recognized it as the king's voice, the owner of this magnificent chicken. She ignored it and reached a hand for the bulb. "No," thundered the voice, "not without permission." She withdrew the hand halfway, yet still poised, fingers open. She ached to feel it in against her, in her mouth, in her twat. "Ask and you may touch." Her mind was still clouded by the draught. Ask? Ask for what? She wondered. "Oh, to touch it," she said, thinking aloud. She did not notice the laughter of the king and his orcs. "May I touch it?" she asked with a look of wonder and anticipation on her delicate face. "Who asks?" "Celebrian. Celebrian asked to touch it." "Touch what, little bitch?" "Touch it. Touch your cock." Saying the word cock for the first time in all the ages of her long life. "Celebrian wants to touch the king's chicken." "Yes. And what does that make her?" "Make her? Why, a whore. Yes," she thought, finding a strange pleasure in the thought. "Celebrian is a whore. I am Celebrian. I am a whore." She smiled and reached for the chicken. The king's hand grabbed her wrist, but gently, as so not to break her mood. "Ask properly. Ask like you mean it, elf bitch," he said, barely able to contain his own anticipation. She turned her tunnel vision to his face. The great pig nose, fat lips, and tusks now seemed somehow attractive in a raw animal way. Staring into his yellowed eyes, jaundice much? She said, "Celebrian the whore wants to touch your chicken. She wants to put it in her mouth. Please?" She smiled, a sweet little smile. It took his complete will to keep from slamming her head onto his shaft, but he steeled himself. It was much better if she did it herself. Much better now and much better later. She was drugged, but she was not yet broken. "By all means, cunt," said the king. "Thank you, my king," she said politely. She turned her vision back to the chicken. It was all she saw. It filled her mind. Celebrian likes the big chicken with its shiny head and bumpy shaft. Such a beautiful chicken, so big and strong. The king shuddered at the words. Never had an elf bitch taken the magic potion so well before. She grabbed the head of his chicken with one hand. The heat surprised and pleased her. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface and around its lip. She cupped the glands in one hand and ran the forefinger on the other along its underside, catching the liquid that had run down it, as well as a fresh drop at the tip. She gathered the liquid on her fingertip and put it in her mouth, savoring the salty tang. "You must ask for my gifts," gasped the king in pleasure. Eat each step, and name yourselves all the names of a whore slut who pleasures the king. Celebrian's mind, though clouded, was still cunning. Bad choice word. Word games, she thought, how fun. She rolled her tongue across her lips. May Celebrian, who loves the king's cock drippings, touch the king's balls? She asked. The king grunted assent. How do you grunt an assent? Celebrian ran a hand along the king's shaft. The full chicken filled her small hand. She felt the bumps of warts and moles pass pleasantly beneath her touch. Oh great, now we've got little moles here. Her hand reached the mass of tangled thick hair at the root of the shaft. Her hand continued down the shaft into the hair, slid to the underside of the scrotum. And next time we'll learn about more about the moles and the chickens.